The concept of getting high in the modern world is a deliberate pursuit of euphoria or temporary escape from reality. It is a recreational act, a choice made in a context of relative safety and scientific understanding. We choose to unwind after a long day, perhaps to soften the edges of our minds or to simply feel a fleeting sense of joy. But what if the pursuit of an altered state was not for pleasure at all? What if it was a desperate gamble for survival, a quest for spiritual salvation, or, most tragically, an accidental voyage into madness? This is not the story of a weekend's diversion. It is the story of a perennial, human struggle, and it begins not in a modern laboratory, but in the brutal, beautiful, and dangerous world of the Middle Ages. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In our quiet, modern moments of rest, we often seek to alter our state of mind with a degree of casual, almost mundane, intention. Perhaps it is the slow sip of an after-dinner drink, or the calm, enveloping smoke of a recreational herb. We are, in these moments, the masters of our experience. We know the dose, we can predict the effect, and we have a scientific framework to understand what is happening inside our bodies. This is a universe away from the life of a medieval person, where the body and the mind were not a series of biological mechanisms to be tuned, but rather a canvas for spiritual and moral forces. Let us imagine a peasant at the end of a long, unforgiving day. His hands are thick with calluses from a lifetime of labor, and a constant, low-grade ache thrums in his bones, an unceasing hum of physical pain. Life expectancy was not as short as is commonly believed, with those who survived to adulthood having a good chance of living past 50, which meant they also had a greater likelihood of experiencing prolonged periods of pain and illness. In this world, an illness was rarely just a biological malfunction. It was often a sign of God's displeasure or demonic affliction. The simple act of living was a kind of pain, and a break from this constant torment was not a luxury. It was a desperate necessity, a physical and spiritual craving for relief. The pursuit of an altered state was not an act of recreation, but a perilous wager for a moment of peace. In this world, before trained physicians became widely available, the vast majority of people relied on the local wise woman or herbalist, a figure whose presence was as essential as the blacksmith's forge or the miller's wheel. These practitioners, often women, held a deep, inherited knowledge of the local flora and fauna. Their cures were a pragmatic, often generational, blend of effective herbal remedies, inherited traditions, and spiritual faith. This role, however, contained a profound irony. In the early Middle Ages, their use of powerful plants was widely accepted. But as the influence of the Church grew, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, this vital knowledge became a dangerous liability. The very same practices that made a wise woman an indispensable asset to her community could be reframed as an invocation of a spiritual evil. This transformation from respected healer to persecuted heretic was a tragic consequence of the changing religious and social climate. Among the most well-known and widely used plants of the era was the poppy, a source of opium. Its use was so widespread that its addictive and dangerous nature was not fully recognized as a social evil until centuries later. Its legacy reaches back thousands of years. Sumerian clay tablets recorded its use as early as 8,000 years ago. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, and for medieval Europeans, opium was an ever-approved next-door medicine. It was a panacea for a wide variety of maladies, with its analgesic, antitussive, and antidiarrheal properties understood long before its complex alkaloids were isolated. The profound irony is that a substance now at the center of a modern public health crisis was, for medieval people, a lifeline, a simple, accessible solution to chronic, unyielding pain, from the debilitating ache of a toothache to the deep, burning sensation of a festering wound. It was a brief, gentle embrace in a world that offered very little comfort. Few plants embody the medieval mind's unique blend of medicine and myth quite like the mandrake. Its human-like root was the source of vivid and terrifying legends. It was said that the plant would let out a fatal shriek when pulled from the earth, killing anyone within earshot. Special prayers and rituals were necessary to harvest it safely, often involving a dog to take the fatal blow. Yet, beyond the myths, mandrake was a potent and legitimate tool in the medieval pharmacopoeia. The plant contains powerful tropane alkaloids such as scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, which have a powerful effect on the central nervous system, causing hallucinations and delirium. It was used as a soporific, a painkiller, and a surgical anesthetic, a practice that dated back to the Greek physician Dioscorides in AD 60. Its use, however, was a terrifying gamble. The line between a dose that could induce a deep, pain-killing sleep and one that could cause delirium, coma, or even death was perilously thin. Its strange, anthropomorphic form and its potent effects led to its association with magic and paganism, and its use as a talisman put its users at odds with the Church, as seen in the suspicions leveled against Joan of Arc. This highlights the fundamental difference between the medieval and modern search for an altered state. For the medieval person, every time they used one of these powerful plants, they were taking a literal life or death risk. The Solanaceae family of plants, which includes mandrake, belladonna, and henbane, was particularly central to both healing and witchcraft. Belladonna, or beautiful woman in Italian, was famously used by medieval women to dilate their pupils for a love-struck look. However, the same compounds in this plant could also induce a rapid heart rate, delirium, and hallucinations, with just a few berries or a single leaf constituting a lethal dose. These plants were key ingredients in the legendary flying ointments of witchcraft, substances that, when applied to the skin, could induce a hallucinatory sensation of flight, out-of-body experiences, and a profound delirium. The very same plant could also be used for a far more sinister purpose: covert assassination. Poisoning was a popular method of killing in the Middle Ages because it was easy to obtain and administer, with no obvious culprit. The infamous Medici and Borgia families were known to use plant-based poisons like aconite and hemlock, exploiting the fine line between a dose that healed and a dose that killed. The fact that these plants could be used for both remedy and murder reveals the universal truth of the dose makes the poison was not an abstract concept but a lived reality in medieval times. The pervasive use of these powerful plants reveals a fundamental difference in the medieval approach to altered states. The potency of a plant varied by season, region, and preparation method, meaning there was no predictable or standardized effect. This meant that every administration was a roll of the dice. Furthermore, in a world where medicine was often viewed as a reflection of one's spiritual state, the use of powerful mind-altering plants was a perilous path. The unpredictable, often delirious effects they cause could be reinterpreted not as a simple physiological reaction, but as a physical, tangible expression of a spiritual state, a divine intervention, a demonic affliction, or cares from a saint. This led directly to the persecution and execution of those who possessed this vital knowledge, a tragic irony in which the very people providing a core social service became the most vulnerable to a spiritual backlash. The medieval person did not have a drug problem in the modern sense of a recreational habit. Instead, they faced a poison problem that was an intrinsic, ever-present part of their society. Their experience with mind-altering substances was not a controlled act, but a perilous, often involuntary, encounter with forces beyond their comprehension. This human struggle is not confined to the Middle Ages. The deaths of Chinese emperors from elixirs containing mercury and arsenic reveal a centuries-long precedent for the fatal pursuit of a miracle cure. And in a final, chilling irony, This struggle resurfaced in the modern era with the 1937 elixir sulfanilamide scandal, where over 100 Americans, many of them children, died from an untested, toxic solvent and a common antibiotic. This modern tragedy proves that the medieval problem, the unproven, unregulated use of a toxic substance, is a universal and timeless human issue. In a world where pain was a punishment for sin and hallucination was a divine curse, the altered state was not a choice. It was an act of survival, a desperate pilgrimage, or a descent into a very real and very present madness. The medieval experience of an altered state was raw, terrifying, and profoundly real, a more intense and raw engagement with a world they already saw as saturated with spiritual and moral forces. This brings us to a new kind of high, one that found its victims without their permission. But what if the simple act of living was a form of pain? What if the only way to cope with that pain was to risk your life? In a world before antibiotics, before anesthetics, before even a rudimentary understanding of germ theory, life was a continuous, unyielding negotiation with physical and mental suffering. The common belief that life expectancy in the Middle Ages was short is often skewed by high infant mortality rates. If a person survived to the age of 25, they had a strong chance of living to 50 or older, and in doing so, they would have a greater likelihood of experiencing prolonged periods of pain and illness. It was a world where a minor cut could become a lethal infection, a toothache could swell into a life-threatening abscess, and chronic ailments were a constant, throbbing presence. The body was a persistent, screaming thing, and relief was a fleeting, almost mythical concept. The pervasive presence of disease was an ever-present, silent narrator of every life. The air was thick with the threat of dysentery, malaria, diphtheria, and typhoid. This ever-present misery culminated in the mid-14th century with the arrival of the Black Death, a plague that killed an estimated 20 million people in Europe alone, nearly half the population. Entire villages were wiped out, and those who survived were often left to face the resulting famine. This was the backdrop of daily life, a physical reality so grim that the mere act of enduring it was a triumph. It is in this context that we must understand the first, most fundamental reason for seeking an altered state. It was not for pleasure, but for the basic, desperate human need to escape from pain. The local healer, often a wise woman or herbalist, was the primary source of care for the majority of the population who could not afford a trained doctor. These figures, typically women, possessed a deep, often generational knowledge of the plants and herbs that grew in the fields and forests. Their cures were a pragmatic blend of effective herbal remedies and folk traditions, which might include charms and magic stones. They were the keepers of an ancient knowledge, a kind of pre-scientific pharmacy that was passed down through generations, and their skill was especially valued in life-or-death situations, such as delivering babies. The deep irony of their position was that while their knowledge was an invaluable community asset, it also made them vulnerable. As the Church's influence grew in the 14th and 15th centuries, the use of powerful, mind-altering plants could be reframed not as a healing art, but as an act of witchcraft. The very wisdom that made them central to village life became a dangerous liability, leading to persecution and execution. Within this dangerous and often misunderstood pharmacy, few substances were as universally embraced as the opium poppy. Its use was so widespread that its addictive nature was not fully recognized as a social evil until centuries later. Opium's history as a painkiller stretched back thousands of years to ancient Sumerian clay tablets. For the Greeks, Romans, and medieval Europeans who followed, it was an ever-approved next-door medicine, a simple and accessible panacea for a wide variety of maladies. Its pain-relieving, cough-suppressing, and antidiarrheal properties were understood long before its complex alkaloids were isolated and studied. For the medieval person suffering from an unyielding toothache or gangrenous wound, a draught of opium was a quiet miracle. It was a gentle embrace in a world that offered very little comfort, a brief moment of peace purchased at a terrifying price. But the poppy was only the beginning of a dangerous botanical journey. Few plants embodied the medieval mind's unique blend of medicine and myth quite like the mandrake. Its human-like root was the source of terrifying legends, which included the belief that it would let out a fatal shriek when pulled from the earth. Rituals were necessary to harvest it safely, often involving a dog to take the fatal blow. Yet, beyond the myths, mandrake was a potent and legitimate tool. The plant contains powerful alkaloids that cause hallucinations and delirium, and it was used as a soporific, a painkiller, and even as a surgical anesthetic. The Greek physician Dioscorides described its use as early as AD 60, and its use in a variety of preparations was documented for centuries thereafter. But the fine line between a dose that could induce a deep, pain-killing sleep and one that could cause delirium, coma, or even death was perilously thin. Every administration was a terrifying gamble. This perilous gamble was not confined to a single plant. Other members of the Solanaceae family, belladonna and henbane, were equally central to both healing and witchcraft. Belladonna, meaning beautiful woman in Italian, was famously used by women to dilate their pupils for a love-struck look, but just a few of its sweet-tasting berries could constitute a lethal dose. Henbane, known as the witch's herb, could induce a sense of body suspension and flight, but a high dose could also lead to delirium, seizures, and a painful death. These plants were key ingredients in the legendary flying ointments, substances that, when applied to the skin, were believed to allow witches to fly to the Black Sabbath. The same plants, however, could also be used for a far more sinister purpose: covert assassination. Poisoning was the most popular form of murder in the Middle Ages because it was easy to obtain and administer with no obvious culprit. The infamous Borgias and Medici families, for example, were known to use plant-based poisons to eliminate their enemies. This pervasive use of powerful and unpredictable substances reveals a profound truth about the medieval trip. The potency of a plant varied by season, region, and preparation method, meaning there was no predictable or standardized effect. This created a culture of both immense hope and ever-present, terrifying risk. The universal truth of the dose makes the poison was not an abstract concept but a lived reality, and the medieval person's experience with mind-altering substances was a perilous, often involuntary, encounter with forces beyond their comprehension. This reality was the canvas for the next phase of this journey, as the high ceased to be something a person sought out and became, instead, something that found them, in a horrifying and unexpected way. We now turn to a truly bizarre and tragic phenomenon. But what if the high wasn't just for pain? For some, it was a direct line to the divine, or so they believed. We now turn from the humble peasant to a more mysterious figure, one who operated on the boundary of medicine and myth. The Middle Ages was a world brimming with unseen forces. The air, the earth, the very food people ate was saturated with meaning, capable of bestowing grace or bringing ruin. In this context, the local wise woman was an essential, and often feared, figure. Unlike a university-trained doctor, who was a rare luxury available only to the wealthy, the wise woman was a cornerstone of village life. She was an herbalist, a midwife, and a repository of a deep, often generational, knowledge of the natural world. Her cures were a pragmatic blend of effective herbal remedies, inherited traditions, and spiritual faith, which might include charms and magic stones. Her skills were highly valued, particularly for tasks like delivering babies, which in this era was a perilous journey for both mother and child. The women who became herbalists were often highly proficient in using the local plants to cure illnesses and alleviate pain, a role that was both vital and quietly radical in a patriarchal society. This role, however, contained a profound and chilling irony. In the earlier part of the Middle Ages, folk magic, and the use of powerful plants were generally accepted as part of daily life. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, as the institutional power of the church grew, the very knowledge that made a wise woman an indispensable asset to her community became a dangerous liability. The church began to teach that witches were servants of the devil, and the use of powerful, mind-altering plants could be reframed not as a healing art, but as an invocation of a spiritual evil. This transformation from respected healer to persecuted heretic was a tragic consequence of the changing religious and social climate, and it forced the wise woman's secret garden from the public square to the shadows. Within this realm of spiritual tension, few plants were as central to the nexus of healing, magic, and persecution as the mandrake. The plant was shrouded in terrifying legends. Its human-like root was believed to let out a fatal shriek when pulled from the earth, killing anyone within earshot. To harvest it safely, special prayers, incantations, and rituals were necessary, often involving a dog to take the fatal blow. The irony is that this myth, which seems so fantastical, likely arose as a way to protect the plant from theft, given its highly sought-after medicinal properties. Beyond the myths, the mandrake was a potent tool, containing powerful tropane alkaloids such as scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, which have an intense effect on the central nervous system. It was used as a soporific, a painkiller, and a surgical anesthetic, a practice that dated back to the Greek physician Dioscorides in AD 60. Its strange, anthropomorphic form and its potent effects led to its association with magic and paganism, and its use as a talisman put its users at odds with the church, as seen in the suspicions leveled against Joan of Arc. The plant could bring wealth and protection, but its mere possession could lead to accusations of invoking demons and witchcraft. Other members of the Solanaceae family, henbane, belladonna, and datura, were equally central to this social and spiritual tension. Belladonna, or beautiful woman in Italian, was famously used by medieval women to dilate their pupils for a love-struck look. However, the same compounds in this plant could also induce a rapid heart rate, delirium, and hallucinations, with just a few berries or a single leaf constituting a lethal dose. These plants were key ingredients in the legendary flying ointments of witchcraft, substances that, when applied to the skin, could induce a hallucinatory sensation of flight, out-of-body experiences, and a profound delirium. The medieval mind, of course, had no concept of an internal, chemical-induced experience, what we would call a hallucination. They believed to be a very real, externalized engagement with the spiritual world. This takes us to the core philosophical difference between the medieval trip and our own. In the medieval worldview, the senses were not just passive receivers of information but active transmitters. Early theories of sight, for instance, held that a ray went out from the eye to the object and then returned, a two-way process that meant holiness and evil were considered physical qualities that could be transferred through sight, touch, and even sound. Therefore, when a person experienced a vivid, mind-altering sensation, they were not simply reacting to a chemical. They were, in their own minds, in direct, sensory contact with the material and supernatural worlds. This rendered the medieval trip a far more terrifying and consequential experience than the modern one, for the body's internal experience was externalized into a genuine spiritual event. A hallucination was not a subjective trip, but a very real engagement with an angel or demon. This is where the witch's garden becomes a dangerous place. The very same plants that provided relief from pain and offered spiritual solace could also be used for a far more sinister purpose: covert assassination. Poisoning was a popular method of murder in the Middle Ages because it was easy to obtain and administer with no obvious culprit, and the fine line between a medicinal and a lethal dose made it an ideal weapon. Infamous families like the Borgias and the Medici were known to use plant-based poisons like aconite and hemlock, exploiting the fine line between a dose that healed and a dose that killed. The pervasive use of these powerful and unpredictable substances reveals a profound truth about the medieval trip. The potency of a plant varied by season, region, and preparation method, meaning there was no predictable or standardized effect. This created a culture of both immense hope and ever-present, terrifying risk. The wisdom of the wise woman, therefore, existed in a precarious state, straddling the line between accepted social service and heretical magic. Her remedies were a vital part of a society grappling with constant pain and disease, but their powerful, unpredictable effects could easily be reinterpreted as a sign of spiritual corruption, especially as the church's influence grew. The use of powerful mind-altering plants was a perilous path, and the unpredictable, often delirious effects they caused could be interpreted not as a simple physiological reaction, but as a physical, tangible expression of a spiritual state, a divine intervention, a demonic affliction, or cares from a saint. This led directly to the persecution and execution of those who possessed this vital knowledge, a tragic irony in which the very people providing a core social service became the most vulnerable to a spiritual backlash. The pursuit of an altered state, whether for healing or for spiritual communion, was a profound and dangerous act that had far-reaching social consequences, and it was a battle for control of the mind and the spirit. But what if the high wasn't something you sought out? What if it found you, in the most terrifying way imaginable? But what if the high wasn't something you sought out? What if it found you, in the most terrifying way imaginable? If the deliberate use of powerful plants was a perilous journey, the accidental consumption of a mind-altering substance was a terrifying and often catastrophic descent. The most potent example of an unintended trip in the Middle Ages was the affliction known as Saint Anthony's fire, or ergotism. The symptoms of this illness were horrifying: a burning sensation in the extremities that gave the disease its name, followed by gangrene that could cause hands and feet to drop off the body due to restricted blood flow. It also caused violent convulsions, agitation, and hallucinations that made sufferers appear crazy. The cause was a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grew on rye grain, a staple food of the poor population. The tragic irony is that a common food source, the very bread that sustained life, could be the genesis of a horrifying, mind-altering illness that led to a slow, agonizing death. It was an invisible and silent curse, an evil that was baked directly into the sustenance of the most vulnerable. This terrifying, involuntary trip was an invisible part of the society's fabric for centuries. The first documented epidemic of ergot poisoning took place in the Aquitaine region of France between 944 and 945 CE, leading to about 20,000 deaths. A second outbreak 40 years later resulted in approximately 40,000 deaths, and the disease was constantly present throughout the Middle Ages, sickening millions and killing tens of thousands. Despite its devastating impact, the cause of the disease was not identified until 1695, in part because of the erratic timing of outbreaks and the fact that it was not contagious between humans, even when entire families would become ill at the same time. The medieval mind, of course, had no framework for a microscopic fungus contaminating a grain. Instead, they turned to the only framework they had: the spiritual. The affliction was seen as a divine curse, a punishment from God, or a demonic possession, a belief system that led directly to a series of bizarre and terrifying phenomena. This takes us to a truly bizarre and tragic historical phenomenon known as the dancing plagues. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Truffia walked into a street in Strasbourg and began to dance uncontrollably, seemingly against her will. Over a period of weeks, hundreds of people joined her, many of them dancing to the point of exhaustion and death. This bizarre behavior was possibly a result of ergot poisoning, with its known hallucinatory and convulsive effects, or a mass psychogenic illness brought on by the extreme psychological stress from repeated crop failures, famine, and epidemics. regardless of the cause. The medieval interpretation of the event was profoundly telling. Physicians diagnosed the dancers as suffering from hot blood, and, in a tragically ironic twist, city officials encouraged the dancing as a cure, believing it would release the pent-up humus. This decision inadvertently exacerbated the outbreak, as the dancing spread to hundreds more people. The phenomenon was seen as a moral failing or a sign of a divine curse, with commentators blaming the wrath of a saint. This reveals a fundamental aspect of the medieval mind. The body was a canvas for spiritual and moral events. An illness was rarely just a biological malfunction. It was often a sign of God's displeasure, a demonic affliction, or curse. When a person experienced a vivid, mind-altering sensation, they had no scientific framework to explain it as a chemical reaction within their own mind. Instead, they relied on their established worldview where the senses were not passive receivers of information but active transmitters, capable of having a two-way interaction with the world and the divine. A hallucination was not a subjective trip but a very real, externalized engagement with a saint, an angel, or demon. This makes the medieval trip a far more terrifying and consequential experience than the modern one, for the body's internal experience was externalized into a genuine spiritual event. The victims of the dancing plague weren't taking a recreational high. They were experiencing a literal and terrifying nightmare, a descent into madness that was not of their own making. It was a perfect, grim example of the era's deep fear of the unknown and the supernatural. The experience was terrifying precisely because it was so real to them, a sign that they had somehow fallen out of alignment with God or had been afflicted by curse. This lack of control, this surrender to an overwhelming force, stands in stark contrast to the modern chill, where a person is always in charge of their experience. The dancing plague was a vivid, physical expression of a society-wide distress, shaped by the cultural context of their time, and it was a horrifying spectacle that highlighted the deep connection between the mind, body, and society. The era's lack of scientific knowledge meant that this horrifying, involuntary trip could only be understood as a divine curse or a sign of spiritual corruption, leading to a profound social and personal reckoning. The quest for a perfect, controlled high in the Middle Ages was not just a peasant's desperate gamble against chronic pain. It was also the dangerous, hubristic pursuit of power and immortality by the elite. While the wise woman's knowledge was a quiet, community-based practice, the alchemist operated in a secretive, often clandestine, world. The term alchemy itself derives from the Arabic alchemy, which in turn comes from a Greek word meaning the art of fusing metals, a process that was believed to be the treatment and transmutation of common substances into precious ones. The alchemists were not just madmen looking for a way to turn lead into gold. They were practitioners of a comprehensive field that was a mixture of science, philosophy, and mysticism, concerned with everything from chemical and mineral technology to the prolongation of human life. In the medieval worldview, the alchemist's art was not merely a mechanical process. It was an integration of theory and practice, and they believed that purity of mind, body, and spirit was necessary to achieve success. Their laboratory, a secret space filled with strange devices, was a place of transformation. Through practices like distillation and sublimation, they discovered and purified chemicals that would one day lay the foundation for modern chemistry, producing things like hydrochloric acid and sodium carbonate. They were the forerunners of chemists, but their true goal was far more ambitious than simple science. They sought to find the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance that could not only turn common metals into gold but also create an elixir of immortality. Now, let us imagine the court of a powerful, aging lord, a man afflicted by the same relentless pain and fear of death that haunted his peasant subjects, but with the resources to chase a more dramatic, and ultimately more dangerous, solution. He has in his employ a court alchemist, a man who has promised a secret elixir, a perfect concoction to extend his life and vanquish his suffering forever. The alchemist's recipes, filled with the obfuscating system of symbols and mysterious names that characterized his craft, called for a lethal blend of powerful psychoactive compounds, perhaps a mixture of opium, mandrake, and other herbs. He was driven by a deep-seated belief in the power of human art to replicate and perfect nature, a belief that was at the core of a long-standing debate in medieval alchemy. The elixir, a dark and viscous liquid, was presented to the Lord with great ceremony. He drank it, confident that he was on the cusp of a miraculous cure. The effects, however, were not a gentle ascent into peace but a terrifying descent into madness. The alchemist had sought to control forces he did not fully understand, and the concoction's volatile nature, which varied wildly based on the potency of the plants, the season they were harvested, and the preparation method, meant the fine line between a dose that healed and a dose that killed was inevitably crossed. The Lord was thrust into a state of delirium and hallucinations, the very symptoms that the Church would interpret not as a medical affliction but as a demonic possession or divine punishment for his sins. The grand, hubristic quest for immortality ended not in triumph, but in a final, public reckoning. The once mighty Lord was left vulnerable and exposed, his madness a spectacle for his court, a grim parable about the inevitable consequences of trying to control the most powerful and most unpredictable forces of nature. The alchemist, driven by a dangerous ambition, had failed. The elixir did not deliver a perfect high, but a final, inescapable doom, a perfect, bitter irony. This is not a purely fictional story. Historical records are often littered with the bodies of those who sought to master or consume a dangerous elixir. In Chinese history, numerous emperors and nobles died from consuming elixirs of immortality that contained toxic metals and minerals like mercury and arsenic. The first emperor to die from such a poisoning was likely Qin Shi Huang in 210 BCE, and the practice continued for 2 millennia despite the common knowledge that such potions could be deadly. This millennia-long precedent for the fatal pursuit of a miracle cure proves that the medieval problem, the unproven, unregulated use of a toxic substance, is a universal and timeless human issue. In a world without scientific oversight, the pursuit of a perfect, man-made remedy was a perilous journey, and the final destination was often not a cure, but a coffin. The alchemist's grand folly, the witch's secret garden, and the peasant's desperate search for relief all cast a long, enduring shadow that extends into our own time. We live in a world of pharmaceuticals and prescribed substances, where the line between a remedy and a high is drawn not by superstition or prayer, but by a meticulously measured dose and a doctor's prescription. But if we peel back the layers of scientific progress, we find the same plants, the same chemical compounds, and, most importantly, the same fundamental human desires that drove the medieval mind to risk everything for a brief escape. Let us begin with the most famous of all, the opium poppy. From ancient Mesopotamia to the Middle Ages, its extract was an ever-approved next-door medicine, a simple and accessible solution for chronic, unyielding pain. This was the state of affairs for thousands of years, with the profound irony of its addictive and dangerous nature not being fully recognized as a social evil until the 19th century. But in the 1800s, this plant-based remedy underwent a powerful metamorphosis. In 1803, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Sertiner succeeded in isolating the active alkaloid, morphine, from opium. His work was a profound leap in precision, transforming the poppy from an unpredictable herb into a standardized, potent painkiller. This was followed by the isolation of codeine in 1832 and the development of the hollow needle and piston syringe in the 1840s and 1850s, which made the administration of these drugs more rapid and efficient. The stage was set for the next, more dangerous act. The 20th century saw the culmination of this quest for a perfect, more powerful painkiller. Chemists, with the benefit of Sertiner's work, created semisynthetic and synthetic opioids like heroin in 1894 and, most recently, fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. The result was the modern opioid epidemic, a sprawling public health crisis that has its roots in the late 1990s with the overprescription of powerful painkillers like OxyContin and Vicodin. The irony is crushing. The same human desire to escape pain that drove a medieval peasant to a dangerous concoction now manifests in a widespread societal problem, where a physician's prescription, intended to alleviate suffering, can lead to addiction, overdose, and death. The poison problem of the Middle Ages, an ever-present, terrifying reality, has re-emerged in the modern world. Only this time the poison is refined, synthesized, and dispensed with the sterile, quiet confidence of modern medicine. The legacy of the witch's garden is equally profound, though less tragic in its modern form. The very same plants that were once the source of a terrifying gamble are now the source of carefully measured pharmaceuticals. Belladonna, known for its ability to dilate pupils and induce delirium, contains two compounds now used in modern medicine, scopolamine and atropine. Scopolamine is used to reduce stomach acid, control heart rate, and treat motion sickness, while atropine is used by optometrists to dilate eyes during examinations and as an antidote for some poisons and nerve agents. Mandrake, with its folkloric history of being a demon-inhabited root, also contains these powerful tropane alkaloids. In the Middle Ages, the distinction between a medicinal dose and a lethal dose was perilously thin, and every concoction was a roll of the dice. Today, these compounds are extracted, purified, and prescribed in precise, reliable doses, transforming a terrifying gamble into a predictable medical procedure. The dose makes the poison principle, once a lived reality of medieval life, has been codified by modern science. Perhaps the most dramatic metamorphosis, however, belongs to ergot, the terrifying fungus that caused mass epidemics of gangrene, convulsions, and hallucinations. In the Middle Ages, it was a dreaded poison, a curse that could be baked directly into the bread that sustained life. The cause was not identified until the late 17th century. However, even before this scientific discovery, an important shift began in the 1500s when midwives in Europe observed that the fungus could be used to induce labor, turning a poison into a potent medicinal tool. This vital observation laid the groundwork for the future of obstetrics, and by the 20th century, ergot had become a rich treasure house of valuable pharmaceuticals after the isolation of its active alkaloids, such as ergotamine in 1918 and oganovin in 1935. Today, ergot-based therapies are used to treat migraines and Parkinson's disease, a stunning reversal of fortune for a substance once known for its horrifying, convulsive effects. In the modern world, the search for altered states of consciousness continues, not just in the sterile halls of a pharmacy, but in the recreational and spiritual practices that have also endured from antiquity. Psychedelic plants, once used in shamanic rituals to commune with the divine in cultures around the world, are now being explored in a modern context for their potential therapeutic benefits in psychotherapy. The pursuit of an altered state for spiritual connection is not a new idea, but a timeless human desire. The medieval mind saw a hallucination as a very real, externalized engagement with a spiritual force, a demon, a saint, or divine visitation. We, with our scientific worldview, interpret these same experiences as a chemical reaction within the brain. But have we truly lost the sense of wonder, the feeling that these experiences might, in some way, be a direct connection to a deeper reality? In the end, the paradox of progress is this. While we have transformed the medieval poison problem into a pharmacy problem, we have not escaped the fundamental human impulse that drives it. We still seek to escape the body's persistent pain, to quiet the mind's relentless anxieties, and to catch a glimpse of a world beyond the mundane. The methods have changed, from the witch's brew to the sterile syringe, but the reasons remain the same. The shadow of the alchemist's folly and the peasant's silent suffering stretches across the centuries, a powerful reminder that our modern quest for a perfect, predictable high is merely a new chapter in a very old story.